Hello everyone, Simon here. Welcome to another episode of Philosophy Takes on the News, the first episode of Series 2. In a moment, you'll hear me say that we recorded this episode on the morning of Thursday, the 8th of September. Later on in the day, we heard the news of the death of Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth II. Obviously, we don't discuss that in the episode. We do discuss matters about the Constitution, but that's very much focused on the UK getting a new Prime Minister, Liz Truss. We decided to release this episode this week in the normal time slot, so I hope you enjoy it.
This is Philosophy Takes on the News.
Hello, and we're back. Philosophy Takes on the News has been away over the summer, enjoying the sand and the sewage on the beach, but we're glad to be back with you for this PTOTN Series 2. I refuse to call it Season 2, although various websites dictate that's how I have to refer to it. Never mind. You may well know who I am, but if not, I'm Simon Kirchin, a philosopher based at the University of Kent. We're recording on the morning of Thursday, the 8th of September. This is the week that saw Russia's invasion of Ukraine continue, as it's done across the whole summer. Fighting remains intense. And this past weekend, Russia continued to suspend its gas supply along the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. There's been severe flooding across Pakistan, and the United Kingdom has a new Prime Minister in Liz Truss. So this week, we're going to think about that new UK government, think about how a new PM is chosen and about conscience in politics. And we'll also think about climate change and reparations. We'll also see what else we get onto as always. In fact, across the summer, as I think you probably know, there's been a hell of a lot of news, some of it uplifting, but plenty of dispiriting, depressing and ominous headlines. Which brings me to this week's guests, of course. Joining me today, we have Graeme A. Forbes, who's Honorary Senior Research Fellow in Philosophy here at Kent. Hi, Graeme.
Hi, nice to be back.
And we've got Piers Benn, who currently teaches ethics at Fordham University London Centre and who's recently taught at Roehampton. Hi, Piers.
Hello, good to see you again.
And we've got a new guest for this new series, Kieran Oberman, who's Associate Professor of Philosophy at the LSE. Hi, Kieran.
Hello, it's great to be here.
Great to have you. Great to have all three of you with us. Okay, so let's get to our first item then. This week, the UK got itself a new Prime Minister. Boris Johnson was forced to resign in the summer, and we have endured a lengthy contest internal to the Conservative Party as to who will be its next leader and de facto Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. This is all against a very challenging background, war in Ukraine, a cost of living crisis, and so on. It raises, I think, a few issues for all of us, and I'm sure we'll get on to those. The one it raises for me is how Liz Truss has become Prime Minister and how she's been chosen. I think I'm right in saying that Liz Truss is unique. She's the first Prime Minister to be chosen by people in her party against the wishes of the parliamentary party. She came second in the election amongst the MPs. Rishi Sunak was first, but Liz Truss won amongst the membership. So that has happened in other cases. So Ian Duncan Smith was second choice amongst MPs, but was chosen by the membership, the Conservative Party, a few years ago, and also similarly Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party. But in both cases, they were appointed leader of the opposition. I think I'm right in saying Liz Truss is the first PM who's come into the role through that route in that way. And that just raises a kind of very interesting question for me, which is we've got a very small electorate, Conservative Party, but it could be another political party, and the person gets to be Prime Minister even against the expressed wishes of their own parliamentary party. And I suppose there's just a general issue then in this sort of situation, how we are as a country choosing or allowing leaders to be chosen. I mean, in a parliamentary democracy, we think that we vote for MPs, we're voting for a political party, and then someone is asked to form the government in amongst the parliamentary majority, and that all seems fine. But in this sort of instance, the convention seems to be creaking at the seams. So I'm just wondering what the three of you think about this and whether you can sharpen up the worry a little bit more. Graeme, you got your hand up. You come in first.
Okay, so, let's think about the constitutional position a little just to get us going. So the principle at work here is whoever commands the confidence of the Commons to form a government. So that is the criterion that we're working with. So there's meant to be a single individual who looks to be in a position to command the confidence of the Commons. So what do we mean, command the confidence of the Commons? Well, it means two things at the same time, and you've kind of drawn that out nicely. So on the one hand, it's the person who represents the will of the people who are not aristocrats, the people who are not members of the Lords or bishops or the monarch, those people. And we established that by having a party with a majority in the Commons, and so that party should be commanding the confidence of the Commons, and then they select a leader through whatever means they as a party choose to do so. They could do it by drawing lots, they could do it by dancing on a rope, a la Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, whatever means they want. So I think one of the tricky things that we find with this constitutional principle isn't so much the means that the party used to choose their leaders. It's that in the last 10, 12 years, since the Fixed Term Parliament Act was passed, the ability to change governments has been restricted so that you can have a situation, as we had with Theresa May, where the government can't do anything. There's no one who can actually get government manifesto policies passed, but they nonetheless can't get removed from office. And we had that again with Boris Johnson, that Boris Johnson was disgraced after he was found out to have, he's not been officially found to have misled Parliament yet, but did it so blatantly that it's hard to conclude that he didn't do that, and lost the backing of his party. Many of his cabinet resigned. It became clear that he could not continue. So normally, without the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, that would have triggered a general election or triggered something very quick because the party couldn't stay in power under those conditions. So the reason we've got this very odd process where where the Conservative Party have chosen a new leader very slowly over the course of a number of months at a time when strong leadership would be very desirable is partially because the mechanisms for removing the previous leader aren't working as historically they would have done before the Fixed Term Parliaments Act.
Great, thanks. Kieran?
Yeah, so I think it's a fascinating question. So, we have these general elections, everyone gets a vote, people do vote, thinking about who the leader is clearly a factor. And then sometime during the course of a government, the leader can fall, and that's happened. So it's counting up. I think we've had 6 prime ministers in the 21st century. 4 of them have come into power in this way. And then when they come into power, it's just the party who gets to decide. And that's odd. That's odd to have the most important person in the country being decided by a small section, because most people aren't, even most Tory voters aren't members of the Tory party. So we've got this very restricted demographic who's making this really important decision. Okay, so how do we decide whether that's a good way of making this decision or not? So what I think about is the literature on democracy, the philosophical literature on why democracy is valuable, if it is. And there's 2 kinds of arguments for it. So one is that democracy has intrinsic value. It represents the people, or it gives everyone an equal say, or, there's different kinds of arguments for why democracy is so important, self-determination, these various big concepts being bandied around. And then there's a different kind of argument, which is that democracy has instrumental value. It's good for the achievement of other things we care about, such as perhaps economic growth or social stability, or whatever it is, freedom. And so, we can think through this issue taking either one of those. Now, as it happens, I don't really go for the intrinsic stuff. I don't think democracy has intrinsic value. I'm not convinced by any of those arguments. And I think to the extent that democracy is a valuable system at all, it's for these instrumental reasons. Now, if you take that position that I do and then think about this question, then you're going to want to think about it not as in, if you were to take the intrinsic side of the argument, you're saying like, this is really, really wrong. Perhaps you'd say this is really, really wrong. It should be the people who decide these really important questions. And so we should have a different system. Maybe the different system would be everyone in the country gets to choose between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, or we have a general election, or, there's some kind of wider demos gets to decide. But I go for this intrinsic view, the instrumental view. So what I'm interested in is which system is going to have the better results. On that question, it's interesting to think, well, how is a leadership contest that's decided by a party different from a general election? Will it produce different kinds of leaders? And I think the answer to that is yes. And the reason for that is you've got different voters. They have different ideas as to what makes a good leader. When you have a party deciding, we see this every 4 years in the US elections, when you have the party deciding that they elect or tend to elect a more extreme candidate than is supported by the general population, or at least their preferences are different to the general population. And the leadership campaign for the Tories this time was real strong evidence of that. They were trying to outdo themselves to see who could be more right-wing, and the candidate that was perceived to be more right-wing won the election. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, if you go for the standard view that kind of polarization, extremism is a really bad thing, then we've got a reason to worry. We've got a reason to worry that a prime minister comes in who's more extreme, who probably wouldn't have been chosen, or might not have been chosen by the general population. Of course, Liz Truss is going to have to moderate her views. She's going to, as we see every 4 years in the US elections, people try and swing back towards the centre after picking up the primary vote. But still, she's made promises to cut taxes and do other things. So even if she's really flexible, there's only so much flexibility there. Okay, so is that troubling? Well, I think it really depends on where you think the truth lies. If you think the truth lies in extremes, whether it's extreme right wing or extreme left wing, then maybe you're going to favour a system like this that rewards those extremes. Although, of course, you're going to worry about extremism on the other side. But if you think the truth lies in the middle, then you're going to worry about the system like this. So I think it really comes down to or one takeaway possibly is it comes down to where you think the truth lies in politics.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Piers.
Yes, I have no strong intuitions about which method of selecting the leader would be better. I think we should distinguish questions about whether we approve of the result of these procedures from questions about the procedures themselves. And one can argue, of course, that people at extremes of both left or right are more likely to be elected if it's left to the grassroots sort of activists than the ordinary voters. That's probably the case. It was actually Tony Benn in about 1980 who proposed the whole thing. He was the originator of it, I think. He wanted the Labour leader, this was a long time ago, to be elected by the sort of grassroots, who are more likely to be what would now be called hard left or whatever it was. And that was seen. I mean, he certainly saw that as a democratic move. He thought it would, really somehow bring it back to ordinary people rather than people who've been sort of elected by those ordinary people. And similarly, I mean, with Jeremy Corbyn in 2015, was it, when he was elected, the same argument was used. But I think we need to distinguish, as I say, the question of whether we like the result from the question of the procedure. The reason why I have no strong intuitions about the procedure, but I have an inclination, which I'll explain, is that, of course, it's already the local activists, the party members who have chosen their MP. And so if you decide it should be MPs who decide who the leader should be, you can say they've already been chosen. They've been selected as the candidate for the party by the local party. So the grassroots democracy has already been satisfied. Unless I've got something very, very badly wrong, unless I'm confused about the whole procedure. In that case, we can say, well, democracy has been satisfied already. Let's leave it, have it at one remove, whereby those who've actually been selected as the candidate for the particular constituency and been elected to Parliament decide on the question. But, I think clearly people worry about the results. I mean, I'm not a fan of Liz Truss. I mean, I hope in a way, for the sake of the country, that her leadership won't prove to be as disastrous as many people think, because we are in a crisis. And I think it would be uncharitable to say, oh, she's a Tory, just get her out, let's hope she fails. But I think that I'm sure, Kieran is right to say there's more likely to be a move towards the extremes. Of course, you could always argue that extreme is just a prejudiced word, and that sometimes extremes are a good thing, and that to present yourself as the middle position is just a rhetorical device. I mean, every position is the middle position between two extremes. I mean, everything can present itself as being the moderate view. You can always invent some extreme to the further wing. But perhaps we could not get distracted by that. My inclination is to say that it should. I mean, if I really had to choose, I'd say it should have been the MPs who decided on the leader rather than the constituents. Just as it should have been and was the MPs in the end who decided, and in fact the cabinet resignations decided to get rid of Boris Johnson. That wasn't put to, I mean, as far as the grassroots in this direct way. So, but that's just an inclination. I mean, I think the complexities of democracy, as Kieran said, are extremely complicated. I mean, what justifies democracy? I mean, there's a familiar argument against democracy that I remember my old colleague Gordon Graeme rhetorically using at St Andrews, which is say, well, it's a disaster for the reasons that Plato spelled out. You wouldn't put a ship you wouldn't put a sort of or any old person in charge of a ship to get it to its destination. So why would you put just any old person or just non-expert people in charge of a government? And it's a very powerful argument. I mean, of course, it's intuitively absurd, but we need to know exactly what's wrong with it. And as Kieran said, we don't quite know what's wrong with it. And maybe we could get onto that. But I'm sorry to be rather rambling about this, but my inclination is it should have been the party.
Another reason why you might want it to be the MP. So one reason is MPs, again, tend to be more moderate. We've seen that in a number of elections, perhaps because they're worried about re-election in a way that the grassroots don't worry about that. And another reason, if you went for this intrinsic view about democracy, then it's not just that they've been selected by the grassroots, but they've also won an election in which everyone got a vote. And so it might be, although giving it to the grassroots might seem the more democratic thing to do, maybe actually the more democratic thing to do, again, if you worry about this, if you believe that democracy has intrinsic value, the more democratic thing to do might be to leave it to MPs.
Yeah. Graeme, you come in and then I've got a few things to say.
I mean, so I suppose I side with Kieran rather than Piers on the idea that we might be interested in what kind of result we get out of whatever procedure we choose, that we might not want to separate them. But I mean, I want to be quite kind of practical about this in a way. One of the results we're looking for is someone who can command the confidence of the Commons. So a lot of this is literally someone who can hold a government together, someone who can get the various parliamentary members of their party to act in concert so as to run a country. And one of the most compelling arguments for me for having the parliamentary party choose their leader is that it's much more likely they're going to follow that leader. It's much more likely that the government will be stable enough to survive and actually get work done, like get legislation passed, get policy carried out. That I tend to be somewhat Confucian in my political philosophy. What I really want is stability. I want a system that is going to work. Justice only comes in once government is able to function.
Can I ask a question about that? Which is why? Why worry so much about stability? I mean, if a government is doing a really bad job, then don't you want it to fall apart?
No.
And can't you have governments that are really stable that do really terrible things? Sure,
but you can't have governments that are really unstable that do great things. So the idea is just a basic level of stability is required for government to achieve anything. So the hope is with democracy, and it might be a false hope, the hope is with democracy is that people will elect better governments given the option. Like if that hope fails, democracy is under threat. But one shouldn't want chaos. Chaos is the thing to be avoided because just think of things that are politically uncontroversial. that you want just institutions that everybody supports to do the things that they're set up to do. If you don't have stability of some kind, those institutions do not function. So you've had a situation in Northern Ireland recently where they have no executive, that they've got a civil servant whose job it is to work out who gets money, but they can only do so under certain limits, and they can't fund things that need money without some politicians approving of this. And there is no executive. This is a bad situation. This, for me, is the nightmare situation that Northern Ireland is currently in, where you don't have a government of any sort, let alone a bad one.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So I certainly agree that you could have situations whereby a government isn't functioning, everything's breaking down, and that's really bad, and that we prefer a government of any kind. But isn't it contextual? I mean, so I guess two thoughts. One is the government, who's in charge, that might all be in chaos and totally undecided. And yet the country is working fine. And we've seen various, there was a time when Belgium didn't have a government for, I think it was, months and months. It was one of the longest times that any democracy has gone without a government. And Belgium carried on just fine. Think about Italy, incredibly successful country in many ways, total chaos all the time at the level of leadership, and yet the country carries on. And then I guess my other thought was there's going to be times when you could get to functioning government, but you've got to have a period of instability in order for the government to collapse and a new government to form. And we've seen that happen at various times as well. I mean, it can't be the case that we prefer any stable government over any unstable.
That would be absurd. I certainly wouldn't defend that.
Certainly prefer Italy. I mean, Russia's had stable government. Italy hasn't. I prefer Italy to
Sure.
I think probably the thought about stability that Graeme. I mean, stability can cover lots of different things. I mean, I think Northern Ireland's a good example. I think another example actually is the Westminster government, where you see for the last few months. I mean, partly it's a strange situation because of Boris Johnson, right? But where you've got loads of select committees, right? We're talking Parliament here, so the NHS might be working or not working, and other parts of the state, right? Courts are working or not working, as we can see. But in Parliament, you've got pictures after pictures on social media of select committees kind of saying, we're here to scrutinise a member of the government about some very specific point of policy. And the government hasn't sent anyone because there's no one to send, or they just haven't bothered to turn up. I mean, that's a government that's not working. It's not fulfilling the basic function where you want someone to turn up and then to be scrutinised by Parliament on the details of particular policy. I mean, if that isn't happening, that's really bad.
I think another problem about stability, I mean, I think you're right. Those who mention stability are right to say it's very important. But governments might become unstable, or at least paralysed and directionless if they're trying to do too much at the same time. And so all these select committees, all these different interest groups, this panicky reaching around for policies that probably contradict each other, but to have to be devised on the hoof to satisfy instant needs, lead, if not to instability, at least to paralysis. And that's another problem with to be avoided. Instability on the one hand, paralysis on the other.
Can I come in with some thoughts of my own? I mean, thanks for all three of you, because that's really interesting. I think across all three of you, so my mind was ticking over again, thinking about the introduction and everything I've been thinking about over the last couple of weeks, because I think we've got a kind of tension that's shown up by the Liz Truss case when we talk about parliamentary democracy. We've kind of got a fiction, but it's a very convenient fiction, a very important fiction, that we're voting for an MP and voting for a party. But I think, as Kieran said early on, of course, we've got in mind who the leader of that party is, right? But we've always been worried across this country about becoming a more presidential kind of country, but we're still a parliamentary democracy. And so in that situation, there's a tension, isn't there? When you have a situation when a new leader has to be chosen, particularly if it's a prime minister, right? Who's got the kind of the main say here? Is it the parliamentary representatives or some subsection, namely the people within that particular party that's been voted into power by the general populace? Or is it the party as a whole, right, in the country? And it's the autonomy of Parliament versus the autonomy of the political parties in the country. So, I mean, and the Tories and Labour and other political parties have certain rules about who's voting for their leaders, and it's slightly different. And of course, I don't feel like I want to infringe on the autonomy of those parties to choose their leaders. That would be bad. And another thought, though, that when they're choosing the prime minister, it feels like the general populace should have some say in what's going on, which is why I think the case of Liz Truss is so egregious, because it's, the voting was in total of Conservative membership was 0.3%, and not all of them voted. So it's probably kind of 0.18% of the population that got to vote for the next prime minister. And so there's an interesting question here, I think, about the autonomy of Parliament, the autonomy of political parties that help to, run Parliament. And I think that's just something really strange. And I also don't think that just one example should mean we should change all the rules. Extreme cases make bad law. Even so, though, this case does show this up as a problem, I think. Graeme, go on.
Okay, so I want to throw a question back to you, just to sort of tease apart parties and parliamentary governments, which is the coalition. So no one voted for the coalition headed by David Cameron with Nick Clegg as Deputy Prime Minister. No one voted for that combination. Some members of the Liberal Democrats were extremely pleased that at last the Liberal Democrats were able to have some power and to influence policy to bring it into the centre. Others were horrified and never voted for the Lib Dems afterwards. But yeah, so I want to throw that question back to you. Like, in that situation, there wasn't a second general election or a second polling of the public to work out if the options are this coalition or something else. What would we prefer? What do you want to happen in that kind of situation?
Yeah, nice. So I think that's a good example. So I think my thought about that is that when we're voting for MPs and voting for parties, and then there's an assumption that we're voting for representatives who won't. I mean, this is a general point about certainly parliamentary democracy and representation. We're voting for representatives, and part of the view is they should reflect the views of the people, but we're also electing kind of, we hope, intelligent people who are going to exercise their own judgment. And this is a kind of very good case of that, where Nick Clegg then has to make a judgment as the leader of the Liberal Democrats about whether to go into a coalition with the Conservatives or not. And of course, as we know, he suffered politically for making that decision. So in a way, I'm more than happy that we then shouldn't have a call another general election, because that's what happened. And so thinking about that thought, then I don't know how that relates to the case we currently have, right? So, but going back to Kieran's thought, which is a nice one, those MPs have been elected by the general populace. They have some sort of authority, and then perhaps we should just say to political parties, we should infringe on their autonomy and say, whatever rules you want to come up with, Parliament decides that it's just the parliamentary representatives that get to decide who the next leader is, not the voting membership of the whole party. But I don't. But that feels a bit wrong to me as well.
Note in the coalition case that both parties had to endorse the coalition, so it wasn't just the parliamentary parties that decided this. It went to conference, and the conferences approved it. So it is analogous in that sense that these were decisions taken by two parties to go into coalition, not merely a selection of MPs to go into coalition.
Good. Piers, Kieran, any thoughts on this?
Well, I do think about previous elections and parallel universes. So to go back a long way, I wonder what would have happened if Kenneth Clarke had been selected over Ian Duncan Smith. Now, that wasn't for Prime Minister, that was leader of the opposition, but a very authoritative, experienced person, Kenneth Clarke, who is also very pro-Europe, would have been a very different leader to Ian Duncan Smith, and Ian Duncan Smith was a disaster for the Tories. And I think the MPs could see that in a way that the grassroots couldn't. And another parallel universe is one in which there's a Labour government in power, and the Prime Minister falls for whatever reason, and a Jeremy Corbyn gets elected. I mean, Corbyn, even more than Liz Truss, is exactly this kind of person, a person who's really popular with grassroots and not popular with the public. And so you could see, in a way, that would be the one way that you could have this radical left-wing Prime Minister in a country that typically doesn't vote that way. And what parallel universe that would be like, and whether that's something we want to be on the cards or not.
Of course, another interesting observation might be that it's worth asking how concerned the grassroots voters, whether they voted for Truss or for Corbyn, were about the electability of the person they wanted to put in. I mean, there's a certain view of, well, the word extremist, but I don't like the word, but, let's say committed people at a particular wing of the party that they're ideologically driven, not that that's necessarily bad, and they think that purity, that getting the purist leader is the most important thing, and if the electorate don't like that person, well, that's the electorate's problem in a way, but we just have to sacrifice victory for purity. And I know Tony Benn was always accused of that. I think Jeremy Corbyn was accused of it. It's another interesting question in itself, whether there's a moral reason for going against your own convictions in voting for a leader just to get somebody who you think is going to be popular with people whose opinions you don't like.
I think that's a fascinating moral question. There's also a fascinating political science question, which is whether that's what's going on. Why is it that MPs are voting for these more moderate candidates who seem more electable, and grassroots vote for more extreme candidates? So one possibility is that they think that being electable is less important. Another possibility is they're just massively optimistic that the rest of the public are going to share their more extreme views, while MPs are more pragmatic about these things.
And there's also an issue about competence that you might think. I mean, again, I like bringing these down from the sort of the high level ideological stuff into the how is this actually going to function. One of the problems that Jeremy Corbyn had as leader of the Labour Party was lots of criticism that he wasn't good at managing the machine, that he wasn't able to do things like timing announcements of the new transport policy, so it wasn't getting competed with by other things he was doing in the news cycle. So he had a shadow transport minister resign just because they felt undermined on their big policy announcements day. Like it's those issues of whether you can actually manage that kind of complex organization that I think are always part of the calculation for a prime minister, because unlike, say, a US president, where you're a figurehead, you don't actually pass legislation, you select a cabinet from people who aren't elected. In our system, you're managing people that have the same electoral mandate you have, so it's technically cabinet government, and that ability to hold a cabinet together, I think, is always a bigger part of this calculation than a lot of our discussions of politics acknowledge.
Listen, let's leave that a little bit there. But Graeme, you raised a question you wanted to discuss quickly. So there's kind of, as I mentioned, that there's a kind of very challenging background, and we've got to think about, as a leader, how we're thinking through policies. So why don't you just introduce it for us?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of relates to this thought that we've already had about stability, that in this case, it's a kind of stability over time, and not necessarily within a government, but across governments and across time more broadly. So I was flicking through the newspapers. I came across an opinion piece by Caitlin Moran in the Times saying, "Insulate Britain were right." If we look back to when they were gluing themselves to the motorway, their plans to make our energy situation better by having lots of funding for insulating houses would have cost much less money than it looks like we're about to spend on subsidizing people's electricity bills through loans over the course of 10, 20 years. Joe Lycett was on Sunday with Laura Kuenssberg and was very sarcastic in a way that got a lot of media attention, saying, Liz said it would be wrong to predict the future, even though loads of people have predicted that we're going to have real issues with paying our energy bills. And there's this thought that lots of the situations we're in seem like ones that not only were foreseeable, but were foreseen quite loudly, and no action was taken. We've had the 5th education secretary in a year, and the National Association for Head Teachers have been decrying this instability. Since 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia, energy security in Europe has been an issue that has been discussed within Europe for a long time. And now we're noticing that there's this huge problem where if Russia cuts the gas off, the gas prices become unsustainable. Interest rates have been abnormally low since 2009, and in historical standards, they still are. But there are huge worries about people's ability to cope with their increase in terms of runaway inflation and the effects on people's mortgages. And these are all things that, and even the pandemic, sort of pandemics have been on the list of global catastrophes we need to prepare for at least the last decade. And we didn't have the public health infrastructure to deal with it. We had to invent it at great expense on the hoof. And there's this worry that this pattern is just repeating, that we've been through, the last 3 prime ministers haven't lasted a full term. Our institutions are not working in the respect of providing policies that are long-term enough to give us stability over time. So we end up in a situation where we spend a lot more money doing much less effective policies because we keep having to be very reactive to crises that were both foreseen and foreseeable. So it's a kind of worry that we're seeing at the moment, going into winter, the results of this kind of structural problem that we've had for some time about getting long-term planning, making difficult decisions that the electorate won't like in the short term, to avoid the kind of series of crises that we've seen since the financial crisis in 2008 and onwards. It seems that we lurch from crisis to crisis and don't have long-term planning for those things that we can see coming. But then again, I'm always mindful of the possibly apocryphal Harold Macmillan line when asked by a journalist what is most likely to set a government off course. He says, "Events, dear boy, events."
Yeah, it's a fascinating introduction, and I've often had similar thoughts myself. I mean, I think one thing you can say is that if there's anything that's absolutely certain, or nearly absolutely certain, is that unpredictable things will keep on happening. So if you think back to the glorious year of 2000, which now seems quite an optimistic year, nobody knew then there'd be 9/11, the financial crisis, Brexit, the global pandemic, and the invasion of Ukraine, to name just 5 things that nobody would have predicted. And yet, it was certainly, if somebody was thinking back in that year, are there going to be sudden, unpredictable and cataclysmic events over the next 20 years? Well, of course, that's predictable. We just don't know quite what they are. So to some extent, we are hostages to what actually happens. But I think Graeme's entirely right. And actually, you mentioned, Graeme, that Kate Moran in the Times. There's another Sunday Times article, I thought rather good, by Matthew Side on exactly this question of long-termism versus short-termism, making the point largely you're making. If you take the pandemic, we realized just a little too late that we hadn't got proper stocks of personal protective equipment, and we hadn't properly planned for a pandemic because it wasn't going to happen tomorrow, or it probably wasn't going to happen tomorrow, any more than the end of the world is going to happen tomorrow. But there are certain things, as people out of the public eye, civil servants and scientists are always warning us, that can be predicted as a reasonable probability over, say, the next 10 or 20 years or something, that we should plan for. The problem is that government planning, which is subject to re-election all the time, is a bit like the academic research excellence framework. You have to have something, you can show for your work over the last 5 years. Otherwise, you're out of a job, probably, or you're not promoted, or you don't get a job or something like that. So there's going to be a psychological impetus all the time towards the short term. But add to that, there's a question of coordination and cooperation. Different people will have different views about what's likely to happen, and moreover, what matters among the things that might happen. And unless you have a sort of genuinely benevolent and wise dictatorship, a sort of Plato's Republic sort of idea, we've got the second best thing, which is democracy, which is very unlikely to yield the optimum outcome, simply because there are competing interests, competing values. I mean, take the pandemic. Some people thought, obviously, part of the problem was predicting what would happen. How many people would die as a result of the pandemic. Another moral problem was the question of how you weigh up the value of people dying out of this particular disease versus the value of the things that we lost during lockdowns, such as businesses, dying relatives, and all these things. So we got clashes of values and of predictions. Well, in a way, I cynically think we need 2 government departments, one the Department of Crisis Management, the other Department of Long-Term Planning, and they should meet every now and again and sort of try to work out a sort of expected utility, if you like, try to bring the best insights of each. I think, the electorate needs to be trusted more, perhaps, we hope we can trust them, to think in the long term. If you read a lot of psychological literature, Derek Parfit talks a lot about this, the bias towards the near. We're much more concerned about the visit to the dentist tomorrow than we are about the one in 5 years' time that's 10 times as painful. That's just the way we are. I don't think we're going to reason people out of it. So we are stuck with something. I don't know a solution, but there does need to be vigorous debate and transparency about what the possibilities really are.
So yeah, it's a fascinating question. To pick up on one thing that is in what Piers is saying is the incentives are all wrong. We've got a system that incentivizes, in democracy, we've got a system that incentivizes short-termism. I don't have so much faith that the general population is any better at thinking or caring about the long term. And if anything, they might be worse. You've got situations in the States, I'm sure this is happening everywhere, where the climate is changing the world. Changes need to happen. Certain areas, for instance, coastal areas, need to be surrendered to the sea, but people don't want that to happen. So they just pretend as if it's not happening. And coming back to something that Graeme said in relation to the energy crisis and the climate crisis and how those two are related, that's really striking. And it's interesting how that wasn't even predicted by the environmental movement, or maybe it was, and I just didn't hear those people pointing to this fact. But perhaps what's so striking is that we could have, by addressing one, we could have avoided the other. Just imagine a world in which we had not only insulated Britain, but also switched to renewable energy. If we put a program in the 90s, paid out significant costs to do it, but got it done. And now we're in a situation, not dependent on gas, where Putin doesn't have this massive power that he does over the rest of the world because of dependence on gas. It'd be a whole different situation. And we would have had a way of dealing with the climate crisis. But it's amazing to think just how there was this other incredibly powerful argument for a switch to renewables going back that wasn't in the forefront of people's minds, which is just that we were dependent on this substance, which this incredibly immoral regime in Moscow had this control over, and we just allowed that to continue.
And indeed, before it was the incredibly immoral regime in Moscow, it was the incredibly immoral regime in Saudi Arabia. And again, it's not that this stuff wasn't out there. My dad often tells me stories of the oil crisis in the 1970s, where you just had insufficient electricity supply, and you would have absurdities where one department in the bank he worked for wouldn't be allowed to have the lights on a day, but his department was an international department, so was allowed, but all the work that they were doing required the department with no electricity to provide it. So they were sitting there with the lights blazing, not being able to do any work. So, the experience of the 1970s was a forewarning of the issues of energy security. And I think environmental activists have been pointing out that the regimes that we get oil and gas from are not always the most morally circumspect. So, I think that has been an issue that they have raised, but largely it's not been at the forefront of our minds because it's been considered such a fringe movement for the last 50 years. And yeah, I wanted to make a quick point about near bias that Piers mentioned, partially because it's an area that I've been thinking about a lot recently. And indeed, there's been quite a lot of literature on. So near bias looks to be irrational until you start building in some features of time that make it make more sense. So if there's genuine uncertainty about the future, you should build that into your calculations. So near bias is usually meant to be sort of ignoring that kind of uncertainty. But in practice, we don't know if we will still have any teeth in 10 years' time. So worrying more about our teeth next year versus in 10 years' time makes sense just because there's lots of uncertainty. Will we still even be alive? There's also differences in what kind of things are valuable. So Elizabeth Harman has a really nice example of a teenage mother who accepts that their life would have been better in every way that would have mattered. had they waited before they'd had children. The children would be better brought up. They would have had more financial security. Everybody would have been happier, except they wouldn't change that actual kid that they actually have for anybody. That once things come into existence, perhaps, particular institutions or businesses or so on, those things start to have a moral character that they don't have as mere potentials. And so one of the ways in which the continuation of things we have now versus merely making the distant future potentially better is that there's value in the things that we have now. And so once you start building in these kind of other factors about the near, that it tends to be things that we actually have a moral relationship with, and there's less uncertainty, it's not so obvious that near bias is just a thing that the uninformed do. And indeed, a lot of the psychological literature on this has a history of a certain kind of classism and racism that means we get to be callous towards the poor or ethnic minorities because they're just not being rational enough. And if only they were more rational, they wouldn't get into these messes. That actually, if you don't know where your next meal is coming from, it's not rational to discount the uncertainty, just to plan on things that are entirely uncertain. So I always want to be a little bit cautious about near bias, though I think our media do a lot of work in framing the issues we should be thinking about. And the media certainly sell more papers or more clicks or whatever by having new issues constantly at the forefront of our mind, rather than long-term issues developing slowly and people sort of seeing these tendencies building. So actually, I think the media has an incentive to make us focus on short-term crises, rather than it's that people in general are bad at this.
Great, thanks, Graeme. Listen, let's leave that whole issue there. Fascinating, both about Parliament and about thinking. And we'll see you all in the next part when we're thinking about a really big short-term crisis and something that needs some long-term thinking. We think about climate change and reparations. And welcome back. The past week has seen widespread flooding in Pakistan. There have been over 1,000 deaths estimated, but also many millions of people displaced and whose lives have been turned upside down. The damage will be huge. There's estimates that one region's lost so many crops that it will damage the food supply of the whole of Pakistan by about half. And I imagine all of this damage is going to cost billions to rectify. Many experts agree that this is a direct result of climate change. We're also seeing other devastating effects around the world. Somalia is currently experiencing its worst drought in a generation, for example. There's the immediate issue of helping countries and people in such situations. There's also the question of what some countries owe others. Earlier this week, Sherry Rahman, who's Pakistan's climate change minister, said that richer countries who've polluted more owe reparations to other countries, often poorer and more at risk, such as her own. She claims that Pakistan has contributed only 1% to greenhouse gas emissions. So as well as richer, more polluting nations having a duty to stop polluting as much as they do we, in the UK, where all four of us are based, do we have a duty to make reparations? And if so, what form should it take? So does anyone want to say any more about this very important issue? Graeme, why don't you go first?
So one of the questions that springs out to me in this is, who are we calling we? So the way that we identify who is responsible for something 200 years ago, who is responsible for the Industrial Revolution, it can be kind of tricky to work out how those responsibilities kind of get passed down through different institutions. So is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland responsible for everything that was done during the British Empire, even if done in Pakistan? So the questions about who we think the reparations are between, I think, needs a little careful thought, since Pakistan has only existed since 1947, that, during the Industrial Revolution, the Republic of Ireland was part of the United, what's now the Republic of Ireland was part of the United Kingdom. And of course, it was different governments and different groups of people who were responsible for making the decisions. So this isn't, as it were, a skeptical claim. I don't think there should be reparations, because there are difficult issues about how we work out how these responsibilities get passed on. I think it's very plausible that, we can't just write off the past as not having an influence on today. Were we to do so, we ought to write off a lot of the loans that are still getting paid back by many developing countries. But we ought to think carefully about how this works, because in the case of companies having debts, when the companies go bankrupt, the debts disappear. If we're talking about nations, it's not clear that there's any equivalent to a nation ceasing. It just gets absorbed into a new state or split amongst multiple states or whatever.
Great, thanks. Kieran?
So I think the case for reparations is pretty overwhelming. There's an interesting question as to what exactly is the basis for it and how we think about pollution historically. So in the climate change literature, there's a debate over, what should be the relevant principle when it comes to this question of who should pay for the effects of climate change, or who should pay for the costs of making the transition to renewable energy. 3 principles get banded around. So one is the one that Pakistani minister was referring to, which is polluters should pay. And then you get into this interesting question, which Graeme was raising, about what to do about historical emissions that happened either before any of us were alive, or happened before the time where we knew that climate change was occurring. So you've got this kind of innocent polluter problem, whereby some of the pollution, it doesn't seem that you can attribute to anybody alive. And then you've got a question of, inheritance of harmful effects as well. It's worth noting that, if you look at a graph of the amount of carbon released, a lot of it has been released in recent years. So, we can say, Great Britain started the Industrial Revolution. That happened a long time ago. And sure, a lot of carbon has been released far more recently than that. And a lot of it has been released in since the 70s and 80s, when the climate science was becoming clearer and clearer. And yet, richer nations that are the major polluters in the world just fail to act. So I think even if you just take this polluter pays principle, I think the case for reparations, just putting the costs on polluters, whether it's reparations for the effects of climate change or for the cost of making of adaptation, should be put on richer nations that on this grounds, on the polluter pays principle. There's an interesting question. What should we say about, the tranche of pollution that you can't blame current generations for? And there in the literature, there's this other interesting principle, which is the beneficiary pays principle. So you might say, British people today aren't responsible. They didn't decide to start the Industrial Revolution. They're not responsible for all the carbon that was released before their birth, but they've benefited from it. And then there's a really interesting literature over, some people have qualms about that. They say, well, wait a second, if you innocently, you weren't responsible for something, you just benefited as a side effect, then why should the cost be put on you? Other people are really warm to this principle and think that it has value. And then the third principle that people talk about is just ability to pay. Some countries are a lot richer than others. Britain's a lot more richer than Pakistan. And so on that basis alone, now you might not call that reparations, but on that basis alone, there seems to be grounds for help to be sent to Pakistan. So I don't really see people band about different arguments. I think just on the polluter pays principle, there's a really strong grounds for a lot of money transferring. If you just think to kind of underscore that principle, if I just leave my bath tap running and I can see that it's running full speed and the water overflows and causes a flood down in the flat beneath me, then clearly, morally and legally, I've got a duty to pay for the cost. And so I think the same thing just transfers. I think countries which are responsible for the pollution have got a duty to pay for the cost.
Thanks. Piers?
Yes, it's a very difficult question, and I'm not really sure what to say about it. I mean, there are questions of principle and questions of practical enactments of any reparations that might be required. I mean, just incidentally, the Radio 4's More or Less program discussed this yesterday and said it was not anything like a third of the Pakistan that had been flooded, but that's just by the by. I mean, we can still discuss the principle.
They said a tenth.
Well, it's okay. Maybe
a tenth of the country, the side of Pakistan.
Yeah, so okay, but it doesn't matter. It's just an aside. I agree with Graham's first question. Who's we? That's a very important question to ask. I was also was going to say what Kieran just said about beneficiaries, because I thought the most plausible argument for reparations would be not to do with attributing responsibility for these past wrongs or acts of folly, but identifying those who benefit from those wrongdoings and those who suffer from it. In the early literature, I remember teaching this many years ago about reparations in general. I mean, there's an argument put forward to say, well, okay, the individuals in a disadvantaged nation, a disadvantage, say, by floods caused by the Industrial Revolution, would not themselves have existed had it not been for those particular wrongs. So, and then we get these Parfitian sort of arguments, which always drop me as a bit of a distraction about, can you be said to be having an unfortunate life now, given that the alternative for you would be not to exist? I think there's got to be some sort of answer to that, but I think it's going to be a very long and complicated one. I think that what is being appealed to here is the idea of strict liability rather than responsibility, moral responsibility. So if I inadvertently crash a car into a parked car and I made no mistake, it was just, in some sense, a genuine accident, whatever might be meant by that, I'm still held liable for it. Then we have a question of how rigorously and comprehensively we extend this principle. So if we say, okay, rich nations are responsible for reparations for that, well, what else do we have to take into account? Might there be ways in which rich nations are themselves owed reparations from other rich nations for various things? How are we to balance the responsibility of rich nations to do this, given the enormous problems that they already face with their own domestic problems? I mean, take Britain, which is maybe not a major offender here, but, we've got the climate problem, we've got social care, we've got the cost of living, we've got all these things. And now suddenly, oh, by the way, we should be paying money to countries where there have been floods because of our past industrial revolution. I mean, there's no limit to how the list can expand. Now, there maybe there's some answer to this, some principled answer, but those are the questions that come to my mind. So I'm rather disturbed and uncertain about the whole thing, I'll admit.
Yeah, so this is super interesting because I think there might be a disagreement. So because I don't find this is a very difficult problem. You said that you thought that the beneficiary pays principle was the strongest principle, and that you didn't think it was about moral responsibility. But so I was wondering why. I mean, just think about, I've got a graph up here, carbon released by the UK over time. There's not much, despite, all the amazing years of the early industrial revolution. That's not when most of the carbon was released. And a lot of it has been released since the 1970s. And then a lot of it has been released in the last few years, when lots of us are still alive, long after we've known about the effects of climate change. And yet we have these elections. The government that wins doesn't do what it should to reduce carbon emissions. So for me, this is actually a case where it does seem like there's a strong argument to be made that certain people to blame and that they owe compensation to the victims of climate change.
So it's more than strict liability; it's actual responsibility.
Yeah, I don't think you have to just depend on strict liability arguments. I think you can make the moral responsibility argument in this case.
Thanks, Graeme.
So I take the point. If we're worried about who the historical we is, how do we transmit responsibility down from the Industrial Revolution? You think, look, let's just put that to one side. Since 1970, we've got persistence of the state. The UK is the same country as it was in 1970 in relevant respects. We're not going through kind of constitutional changes. Maybe the Czech Republic is, former Soviet countries are going to have difficulties about how they divide some of this up, but in the UK's case, it's going to be fairly straightforward. But in this case, I start to wonder why it is that we think the relata here, the things related by the reparation relation, are nations rather than entities of a different size. So if we're talking since 1970, in many cases, the same corporations still exist and can be held morally responsible for the actions that they carried out. The same individual, if it was a government that did something, the relevant state can be held responsible for government policies passed by, So when we were setting up earlier, it sounded like we were talking about nations owing other nations. And nations are kind of not particularly organized social units. They're people joined together by culture and language and geography in some cases. But if we're talking about particular institutions or particular individuals, so suddenly I get a retrospective tax on all my energy bills that I also get a government loan out to pay. Since we're getting government loans to pay for my future energy bills, we might as well get government loans to pay for my past energy bills. And we sort of, we actually assign it to people who have fairly direct responsibility. If we're doing the post-1970 argument, I wonder why the relata are these big kind of amorphous things, nations, rather than something more specific with more direct responsibility.
So I completely agree with that. So I think it comes down to individuals. I take an individualist approach to morality. So I think ideally we'd find the individuals who are responsible, and then they would pay to the degree to which they are responsible. So presumably, if you were head of an oil company, then or a politician, you're in some ways more responsible for the climate change than an ordinary voter. But I also think ordinary voters are responsible. So I think responsibility is quite widely shared. And then there's the practical question, which is, but I agree, it gets complicated at a theoretical level. And then there's a practical question, well, who's going to pay in the end? And how are we going to find all these people who are responsible and tax them to the exact degree to which they should be taxed? That's going to be really difficult. It's interesting. People do raise all these issues about, is the UK the same country as it was in the past? Or why should it be the whole country paying? Why shouldn't it be individuals when it comes to costs? And then, I'm not saying this is true of you, Graeme, but I'm saying it's true of a wider public debate, is when it comes to things about national pride or territorial ownership or who should own what or whatever, all those things, people suddenly are statists. And it's this country that was responsible for X, Y, and Z. And so we should reap the benefits.
I'm happy to be statist all the way down. Like and I'm happy for equity on these things. And I think I want to acknowledge that you're right, that a lot of the debate does seem to have this inconsistency, which is why earlier in my comments, I adverted to the fact that we're getting loans that were taken out, against the country long before 1970. That there are, we've only just paid off the Second World War under the Marshall Plan, in the last 10 years to the US. So we do clearly acknowledge that there is persistence in these financial ways for some purposes. So the question of persistence isn't but how is it even possible that there could be persistence of states? But actually, it looks like some answer to this question is going to be quite important to the detail of how practically this works. And as a metaphysician, I'm just really interested in how those questions work, and I want to think through them rather than the kind of Kantian angst of how could we even conceive of persistence through time. I think social entities clearly persist, given that there are financial debts that go beyond anybody alive. And so the system clearly presupposes that. But we also need an account of how exactly that's working. And it gets really tricky if we're talking over 1,000 years, not that tricky if we're talking over 50 years.
Yes, I want to raise a general question, which is quite interesting, of when does de facto liability or responsibility lapse? So when you think about the legitimacy of states, it's the case that most states began by usurping another state and starting wars. That might have been 100 years ago. Now we don't think, no, it must be dismantled because that's how it began. is there some particular point when it's reasonable to say that, or do we just say, well, everybody now accepts that this state exists, and the past is the past? And I don't think there's any philosophical answer to it. I think we just philosophically accept that this is what happens, that we, but just the passage of time lessens liabilities and responsibilities and has implications for legitimacy. But I doubt we can be much more precise than that. It's just a more general question, as tangential to the original one, but just one that occurred to me.
Yes, and I got some other questions buzzing around my head out of this. So here's two. So earlier on, Kieran, when you were making the other points, you just said, towards the end, we just give them a bunch of money and that's it. I'm just wondering whether that is what reparations are, or whether we can, because let's imagine it's nation states, right? So their UK PLC pays a huge amount of money, billions upon billions across 5 years to Pakistan, presumably to the nation of Pakistan, to the government of Pakistan on behalf of the people. Is that all we do, or are we allowed to have certain strings attached, which says, and a certain proportion has to be spent on these people in this region, i.e. particularly poor people who are vulnerable for flood defences, right? Or do we trust the government of Pakistan to do the right thing by their people? I think there's an interesting question there. And then secondly, who decides on what the value, what the amount of the reparations are? Do we trust some supranational body to do this, or do we just rely on very complex negotiations between countries just agreeing between themselves? I think that's an interesting issue as well. So I don't know if what anyone's got any quick ideas about those two things, and Piers as well. So go on, Kieran.
Yeah. So again, I think we need to separate the kind of practical questions from the moral questions. So morally speaking, I'm an individualist when it comes to the perpetrators and an individualist when it comes to the victims. So we should find the people who are suffering, and they should be the people that are compensated. I think we've got good reason to worry about governments like Pakistan, which has got all kinds of problems, like lots of governments around the world, and worrying about money and resources making it through to the people who need it the most or deserve it the most. So again, morally speaking, I think we should do this on an individual basis. And I also think that it's possible to figure out, economists do this all the time, trying to come up with figures for the cost of climate change. And there's various debates in that literature, but people do come up with figures. So I don't think that's so difficult. But then there's the practical question, which is how are you in a world in which states run the world? How are you going to make these decisions? And generally it's going to come down to states giving resources to other states. Governments are going to inevitably be involved. And how much resources are transferred comes down to government negotiations in the real world. Perhaps it shouldn't work that way, but that is how it works.
Yeah. I think I agree with that. It's very confusing. I still come back to the point about how thorough are we going to be? If you get the idea that we're responsible for reparations because of things that not just our ancestors did, but things that people sufficiently close to us did, then do we have a non-arbitrary way of factoring in a sort of ranking of all the things we might be responsible for? What's most important? What's number two? What's number three? And who shares responsibility with us? I think questions of assigning responsibility are tremendously difficult, but beyond that, I haven't really worked it out.
Great. Okay, well, let's leave things there. Thanks, all three of you. We'll see you in the next segment when we'll be thinking about our consciences. And welcome back. Let's return to UK politics. The new UK Health Secretary is Therese Coffey. She's a practicing and devout Catholic who's expressed views in the past about abortion. The British Pregnancy Advisory Service has raised some concerns about this as Coffey comes into her new role. Whilst referencing abortion in this intro, we're not going to discuss the detail of it. In case you're interested, we did discuss the recent reversal of Roe versus Wade in the US in a previous episode. I believe it was episode 10 of series 1. Our focus in this segment is going to be different. I think the example of coffee and some other examples as well raise a more general issue of how political issues and policies connect and clash with what are often termed issues of moral conscience in politics. Piers, do you want to say a little bit more about this for us, please?
Yes, you've given the basics in your introduction. I noticed, looking at the BBC yesterday, that Therese Coffey is a practicing Catholic, and the sort of practicing Catholic I think is prepared to try to enact her views as far as possible on abortion. Not all Catholics, Joe Biden I think is a possible case, are prepared to do that, but it looks as though she is. Now, questions like abortion and euthanasia have always been matters of conscience when it comes to votes in Parliament. There's a free vote. There's no party whip. There's no party line. It's not just because people can have different views within the parties, but I think more fundamentally because certain issues are seen in some vague sense to be defined as issues of conscience, as if other political issues weren't. But then, we can perhaps discuss that distinction as well. That strikes me as broadly right. And I really want to sort of kick off a discussion about what we mean by conscience, whether it has any particular authority, whether it's owed any particular respect. I mean, quite regardless of what Therese Coffey might do in her role. And by the way, she's not going to try to reverse the laws, I think because she knows she can't. But she might be as obstructive as she can be when it comes to policy formation or funding and this sort of thing. So that might be something for people who disagree with her on this question to worry about. But on conscience, perhaps I can be really old-fashioned and recall or inform you of two pertinent questions asked by St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century about conscience. Question 1, does an erring conscience bind? And question 2, does an erring conscience excuse? Now, his answer is, oddly, perhaps yes, an erring conscience does bind, meaning that it's always wrong to do something that you consider to be wrong, whether or not you're right in thinking that thing to be wrong. So I suppose a contemporary example might be, supposing I'm an ethical vegetarian. I think it's wrong to eat meat of animals that have been killed for the purpose of eating them, but I succumb to temptation and I eat a ribeye steak. Do I do something wrong? Aquinas, I think, would say yes, even though he wouldn't believe it was wrong to eat the steak, because I'm showing a preparedness to do something that's morally wrong. On the other hand, does an erring conscience excuse? Have I done the right thing just because I thought it was right? Well, obviously not. This is where you get the appearance of paradox. There's a famous, rather sort of disturbing case of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the Nazi SS, saying that he believed that we must suppress our natural humanity to develop Nazi virtues. So he was following his conscience. But his conscience, Aquinas would say, would clearly be in need of re-education. You're not off the hook morally just because you do what you think is right. And I think that's the solution Aquinas will come up with. You're in a moral pickle if you're someone like Himmler. The only solution is to re-educate your conscience. But that's really a sort of way into this question of the authority of conscience, because it reminds us, first of all, that there is something, I think, we can discuss it, morally wrong about doing something you think is itself wrong, whether or not you're correct or not in your moral belief. And also that you're not just off the hook because you do something wrong and that you think is right. Now, when it comes to voting in Parliament, I think there's a sort of lip service being given to something like Aquinas' thought, in the idea that people must not be forced to do something they would consider wrong, say by being forced to vote against an issue of conscience, to vote for euthanasia or something when you think it's wrong, and you'd be collaborating in some sense with that wrong in voting for it. Similar with a variety of other issues. So one question I think is should there be these exception clauses when it comes to free votes? There's a possible analogy here with an issue in medical ethics that's been much discussed by writers like the Oxford utilitarian philosopher, I think he's a utilitarian, Julian Savulescu, who has argued, when in a medical context, that doctors and nurses should no longer be allowed to exempt themselves on grounds of conscience from participation in abortion. And he probably thinks that applies to other things too. Why? Because it compromises patient care. A patient has a right to expect the services from a doctor or nurse that are now regarded as part of the job. If somebody seeking an abortion goes to a GP and says, I would like a referral for an abortion, and the GP says, sorry, I don't do that, it's against my conscience. Well, that's all very well. You could say it's even self-indulgent for the GP, but where does that leave the patient? Savulescu argues that, if you have that sort of moral view and you want to enter general practice, you ought to think very carefully about whether you're in the right job, because there's no right to do a job if you're, not prepared to do what the job requires. Of course, one deep question is, what should the job require? Are there not various side benefits from allowing doctors to act conscientiously? And I suppose analogously, we could try to pursue the analogy anyway. Somebody might say, look, things like abortion and euthanasia and assisted dying should no longer be free votes, for the same reason, or something analogous to the reasons that people think that doctors and nurses should not be allowed to refuse to participate in abortions. Remembering, of course, that they're not being forced to participate, they're just not being allowed to do jobs that require that sort of thing. There's a tangle of issues, I think. I mean, I've only painted a very broad impressionistic picture of it. But I think the authority of conscience and to what extent others should respect your conscience is a fascinating topic that knows of no easy resolution in general.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Piers. Kieran, Graeme, any thoughts? Kieran, why don't we go with you first, and then we'll go on to Graeme.
Yeah, so it's a fascinating question. I mean, we've had this, tradition in Parliament that you get these free votes on particular issues, and then these other issues, you're whipped. So you have to do what the party says. And it's a very strange system. I mean, it's a strange system that we have whipping. Why do we have that? And then it's made even stranger by having these free votes on particular issues, which are called issues of conscience. And then you think, well, what's the difference? So it can't be that these are the only issues which are really important. They're not the only issues which are matters of life and death. The government is making decisions all the time which have an effect on who lives and who dies. So it's not the only issues which are moral issues. Every piece of government legislation that's put before Parliament has all kinds of moral issues and questions. And so people, can, on all the issues in which people are whipped, they can feel that they're violating their conscience by voting against their own views, and MPs do that all the time under pressure from their parties. So what makes it different in these particular cases? And I kind of struggle to see the justification there. My only possible thought is that there might be a justification grounded on diversity when it comes to religion. So it might be that, the Catholic Church has changed a lot over the years, and we're now in a situation where, look at a country like Ireland, in which lots of Catholics are just not taking the official view. But if you went back in time, when the Catholic Church was perhaps more disciplined, to the extent that ordinary Catholics, followed the leadership, then it might have been, there could have been an argument for just having free votes on certain issues, just so that to allow people from certain religious minorities to vote a certain way, so that you can keep them in Parliament or keep them as part of the government or whatever. So I can see possibly an argument there, but otherwise I just don't understand the system. And then what's going on currently with this health minister, I mean, that's all quite strange as well. So she's, if I understand it correctly, she's kind of using the fact that it's this free vote, this personal conscience issue, to argue that it has therefore got nothing to do with her role as health minister. But again, that seems odd to me. I don't see why we shouldn't peer into what she's voted for in the past to judge her as to whether she would be a good or bad health minister currently.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. Just to add, so in the last few hours, I think, building up to the recording, certainly yesterday, when this question was put to her, Therese Coffey said she was fundamentally a Democrat and wasn't seeking to change anything about current legislation. Graeme, why don't you come in, and I've got a few thoughts as well.
I mean, so that last thought I think is quite useful here, is that it's important to distinguish here between members of Parliament and members of government, even though most of the members of the government are in Parliament. So there's a question about whether votes for legislation should be votes of conscience or free votes. I think Kieran's explanation of being forced to fire someone from the government for voting a particular way on a certain divisive issue is very difficult if you want to have a government and you need to discuss issues that you know to be divisive. So you have a convention that some issues are kind of are separated off. Like, that pragmatically makes sense to me. But there's an interesting issue about someone being the health secretary who is managerially responsible for the operation of a Department of State. And even if they're not planning to change the law and they're not planning to make strategic policy decisions about the direction in which things go, just a question of how one prioritizes things. So which emails do they sit on for 3 days because they just can't bring themselves to answer them? What kind of delays happen as a result of someone feeling uneasy? Just to take it away from a sort of rather heated issue, I'll tell an anecdote that a department I used to work in, I established a previous head of department had removed any reference to metaphysics from the description of the department's activities because they didn't feel there was any philosophical area called metaphysics. And so they couldn't bring themselves to be the head of a department in which metaphysics was purported to be done. And then when I was head of that department, I reinserted all the references. Was that an issue of conscience? I think it was. I think it was an issue of intellectual integrity for us both. In fact, because, but it seems like quite a strange thing. But then, if you are managerially responsible, not just for some domain of activity, but also for a group of people working under you, the questions about how your personal beliefs interact with that I kind of want to say much meatier, because it's not just a question of do you refuse or not refuse. We're not dealing in the kind of do you do or not do. There's a lot more how do you do, how much do you allow someone working under you with different views to yours the ability to express their views in what they do, or how much do you micromanage them. Lots of questions about what kind of a manager you are come in, rather than the very binary, do you vote in favor or against, that you get with legislators. So one of the things I think is really interesting with ministers, and also in the US context, Supreme Court justices, where they go to a lot of questions about what their personal views are, precisely because they're interested to know how they're going to fulfill the role, rather than merely what things that they will vote in favor of and what things they will vote against. So I think the kind of the meatiness of being a manager, being managerially responsible, is kind of really interesting and underrated as a philosophical topic. And I suppose, I want to ask Simon your opinion on this, because I know that you've had quite a lot of experience and are now president of the British Philosophical Association. You've got a lot of experience of being in a position where you have your own beliefs, but are also responsible for an area of activity with lots of other people in it.
Sure. Goodness. You stopped there. Now I've got to answer it. Certainly when I was, as some people know, I was Dean of Faculty for best part of 9 years at Kent. And there are all sorts of pragmatic, Scylla and Charybdis decisions I used to have to make kind of every day, when I used to have to put my personal thoughts aside and represent or advocate for particular things, because I was acting on behalf of a group of people in that role. I'm not going to say, some examples immediately pop to mind, but I won't say what they are in this public broadcast. I think there's another example I was going to bring in alongside the examples we've already voiced, which I think gets at some of the issues here, goes back to something we were talking about in the first segment. So thinking about whether you're Foreign Secretary or indeed Prime Minister, there's all sorts of business one has to do with other countries and states that one might feel are not the best on certain things. So we were talking about Middle Eastern states and human rights issues. I noticed that during the summer, when people were getting very worried about Russian oil and gas, then Joe Biden, Boris Johnson were jetting off to the to the Middle East to try to talk to various governments there. And people were criticising them for doing that. And I mean, as people will know who've listened to this podcast, I'm not Boris Johnson's biggest fan. I had some sympathy for him going over, because I mean, what's he supposed to do? Say, well, we're not going to worry about oil and gas, and everyone's going to freeze in the winter. I mean, at that stage, even if you've got some quite serious qualms about what that state has been doing, I think you need to negotiate with them about oil and gas. So I had some sympathy with both Johnson and Biden and other people in that situation. I think that there's an interesting that's slightly different from what we were talking about, which is, I think, you're responsible for kind of a whole government department or something which has kind of the business of, medical care or whatever it might be, and you put your thoughts aside in your conscience. But it's kind of in the same sort of area. I'm trying hard to articulate what the difference is, but I don't think it's coming straight to mind here. But there's something around kind of taking one for the team, I suppose, and just doing your duty because you're in a particular sort of role, which is where I started with the dean thought, Graeme, right? So, you just have to get on with it, and you have to put some of your own particular moral or other views aside because you've made a decision to go for this particular role. I mean, yeah, actually, so going back to Therese Coffey, I mean, obviously she's health secretary and indeed deputy prime minister. It's well known that she's good political friends with Liz Truss and wants to take on a larger role in government. But if she was really committed to particular views, then she might want to say, sorry, whatever I do, I can't do Secretary of State for Health because of particular views. I mean, if there was a particular, and similarly, you'd say, oh, sorry, I can't be Foreign Secretary because I don't want to jet around the world and talk to dictatorships that we have trade deals with. I mean, you could say that. So that was a bit of a rambling answer, Graeme.
Well, so the first thing that you said, Simon, and the thing that Graeme was getting at, I think is just fascinating. So, which is this question of kind of role morality. Like, people assume certain roles, they might disagree with what they're being asked to do, but they have assumed that role. And I mean, your small case about being head of a department, and the fact that even in that particular example, every day you're needing to make decisions for the sake of the department, which might not be exactly what you would have chosen had you had a quote unquote free choice on the matter. And so then in a way it makes me sympathetic when I think about that towards someone in Coffey's position. There was a similar case many years back on a different issue with, I think it was a Welsh agricultural minister, so Labour, and she was a vegetarian. So there was massive pushback from the farmers. Of course, most farmers are Tories, so there was a dimension of that. But anyway, they said, I don't see why we shouldn't believe them, that they objected to her appointment because she was a vegetarian. So they couldn't believe that she would be working in their interests. And she said, "Look, those are my personal views, and they're distinct from my job. My job is to represent Welsh agriculture. That includes that includes the meat industry." So, and I've kind of split on this. I think maybe it's just a tragic problem because, as your own example reveals, it's true that people do on a day-to-day basis fulfill roles, and they can, to some extent, put their own views aside. And that's just a part of how the world carries on functioning as it does. And so it seems a bit unfair to say to a minister who's a vegetarian or against abortion or whatever, you're incapable of doing that, when there's so many examples of people doing that all the time. At the same time, the tragic part of it is, how do we trust them? So, especially when it comes to Graeme's kind of issues of, which emails are you sitting on, or all these parts of people's jobs that we can't look into. We can't see what they're prioritizing or deprioritizing, and so we're inevitably suspicious. If your personal views are so contra to the role that you've taken up, how can we trust that you're going to put your personal views aside and fight for the cause that we, the group, believe in?
Yeah, I mean, can I ask Bilal a likely reply of Therese Coffey? She'll say, okay, I'm a dissident on this particular issue. I'm trying to make a difference. I'm a democratically elected MP. Incidentally, she probably wouldn't say it's because she's a Catholic. She'd probably say that, yes, I am a Catholic, but Catholics have a moral position that can be defended by reason, so we can leave religion out of it. That's just a kind of bracketed point, really. It's a moral view. It's a moral view which strikes me, it's not one I agree with, but it strikes me as one that disturbs me. It's not obviously absurd that abortion is a serious moral wrong for reasons that are fairly familiar, cutting off an innocent life and so on. And therefore, she would say there should be a voice in a democratic system for somebody with this minority view. Now, would it be possible for somebody with that moral view to recognize a distinction between the role, as it were, and the person in the role? She would, of course, say, well, the two things are inseparable, and I'm trying to reshape the role. But then we have the question of, I suppose, the point Simon was making about this intuition we have that there are certain decisions that we can take collectively when individuals on, say, the collective don't agree with the result. So a trivial example that comes to my mind, I never had an elevated post such as Simon's as dean, but I'm at an exam board. I disagree with a co-marker about whether a candidate should get a 55 or a 62. I think it should be 62. My colleague thinks 55. She has just as much of a right as I do to decide the final grade. So we go along with the process. So I sign the paper that says, okay, she gets 55 or whatever it is. That strikes me as intuitively, I don't like the word intuition, but stuck with it, perfectly acceptable in a way that were I to be somebody who thought abortion was murder, I would not think it okay to be complicit in that way with a process that leads to the promotion of what I consider to be murder. Now, can we find some principled way of distinguishing these cases? I think that's a genuinely interesting question. I do think there's, obviously, for reasons I think that Kieran hinted at, there has to be room for pluralism and dissidence in any collective, including the medical profession. The idea that no doctors should be allowed to practice as just say GPs or obs and gynae doctors unless they took a pro-choice position strikes me as simply taken in isolation, somewhat sinister, somewhat repressive, if you like. Now, I'm aware of the counter-arguments about patient care, but these are two things to be weighed up in a way I'm not entirely sure how they should be weighed up. So I'm really just throwing questions out here because I'd be very interested to know what people think.
I think there is an interesting distinction that could be made as to two kinds of arguments for why you might allow people to go with their conscience on a particular issue. So one might be that you think that you're worried about their conscience. So you think that people just are entitled to follow their conscience rather than enact what you think they should or has been democratically decided or whatever it is. And a very different issue, a very different kind of argument is about diversity or morale or it's other kinds of values. And I think it is helpful to distinguish those two issues. So you might think, in the doctor's case, it might be that you've just got lots of really good doctors who take the stand that they do, that they're pro-lifers. And you don't want to get rid of those doctors, or you don't want those particular people in the profession. Or you think about the vegetarian agricultural minister case. I mean, presumably vegetarians are really good people to have, or an argument could be made that they're really good people to have as agricultural ministers because they're going to care more than the average person about animal rights. And therefore, when it comes to things like humane killing and how we treat animals, that they're going to be the people that are going to push for those things, perhaps more than the average meat eater. And so to exclude them, we might prevent people from serving in that role who would, it's not that they would necessarily push vegetarianism on everyone, but they might achieve certain values that are far more broadly shared. I mean, a similar issue crops up in jury selection, and perhaps there's an extension of these same kinds of issues into that domain as well, where in the US on murder cases, often jurors will be excluded by the prosecution on the basis that they're against the death penalty. And again, that's not just, even if you're in favor of the death penalty, you might be troubled by the fact that people who are against the death penalty are being excluded because they might be a particular demographic and they might be a good group of people to have on a jury.
Just on this topic, it's worth noting that there is, in the case of Catholicism, a particular history in this country of them as a demographic being disenfranchised. That it's a relatively recent thing that they were able to hold office. I always get a bit nervous about but how could this Catholic possibly hold the position of Secretary of State? Oh, because we were worried about these particular policies. Like, it's not so long ago that the idea that someone who followed the whip of the Pope could not be a Minister of State, because how could they be appropriately patriotic? So not only are there issues of diversity, but some of them have a kind of history that we ought to be aware of.
I mean, going back to the general issue of moral conscience, I'm just thinking about, flipping it, right? Because we want our politicians, just to stick with that example, to have a moral conscience, right? And to have views and to express those views not only in cabinet and behind closed doors and debates, but sometimes to act on those views. We don't want people who are just, in a very pejorative sense, highly pragmatic, such that they've got no principles and no views at all, and they're just going to go with whatever is politically expedient or otherwise. I suppose really then are we looking for people with a certain character who can achieve the right sort of balance in the moment of sticking up for what they believe in, but also making sure that doesn't get in the way appropriately with doing their job? Is that really what we're after?
I hear that in some parts of Europe, Liz Truss's nickname has become the Iron Weathercock, because of her ability to change depending on which way the wind is blowing. So this is a concern that has been voiced recently about, indeed, I saw an article in the New Statesman not too long ago, sort of saying that one of the problems that we find in politics is a lack of ideology, that everybody is just saying what seems to be the right thing to say at the time and not being driven by any sort of larger moral concerns. I'm not sure the extent to which that's true or just a sort of reading into the situation. But yeah, we definitely want some kind of balance, right, between actually getting things done. Like, if everybody stands on points of principle, that's a recipe for the kind of paralysis that Piers was talking about earlier, where, no, I can't possibly, do anything on this issue. Like, if you like Confucius, you might think that the orientation at which you lay your mat to pray on is a moral issue. That whether there are dirty dishes in the sink is something. Look, until we've cleaned the draining board of dirty dishes, I cannot be expected to work under these conditions. That would make it difficult to live together. So political compromise is required for any democratic country, just because you've got a bunch of people with moral views that have to work together. However, democracies don't work either if there are no moral views. There needs to be some sort of negotiation into shared directions of travel in order for that to work. And I think that the two extremes there of being purely pragmatic but having no principles whatsoever, and being ideologically driven but totally uncompromising, make it difficult for an organization that just needs multiple people inputting into it. That the Prime Minister can't do everything. They need a cabinet, they need a government to form policy on their behalf, to carry out actions. And if everybody finds points of principle everywhere it's possible to find them, that's a recipe for paralysis. And indeed, exactly why places like Belgium went without a government for many months is because there was no ability to compromise amongst the people able to form a government.
Yeah, it might help a bit to distinguish the compromise with the less than perfect and compromise with what you regard as absolutely forbidden. So now we have the question of what things are absolutely forbidden and what counts as complicity. Yes, starting a departmental meeting before the dishes in the departmental sink have been washed might be less than ideal, but I think to resign because you will not attend this meeting if you're compelled to tolerate dirty dishes, that would seem eccentric. But also I think it's worth saying pragmatic in my book simply means what works. And so a pragmatic solution, I think, is one that works. It may be morally less than ideal. The issue is whether it's morally forbidden or even morally discourageable without being forbidden. This is perhaps where the line we need to think. And that's, of course, in moral theory, very, very difficult to know what kinds of actions are absolutely forbidden as opposed to usually forbidden.
Well, on this turn towards pragmatism, a bunch of us on this panel seem to be doing. I mean, you could extend it further. I was thinking, even when it comes to these questions of conscience, there's a question of whether you should respect people's conscience for any kind of deep reason to do with conscience, and there's another question which is just, do you want to traumatize people? So even if you thought that there was no kind of, that people didn't deserve to have a special exemption on certain issues because they have a right to follow their conscience, you might just worry about forcing people to do certain things which they find abhorrent and the effects on them personally. One puzzle I've got for myself is when it comes to MPs voting and giving them free choices, I'm not very sympathetic. Or at least I think we should be. I don't have a problem with the system where everyone gets a free choice all the time and we just get rid of whipping. I think whipping is quite strange. But having these certain exceptions where we have these free choices on conscience matters, I find puzzling. And yet at the same time, when it comes to something like military service, I'm far more, even if we've got a just war, even if we imagine that forcing people to fight could be right, I think that's really hard to justify, but imagine a case in which it is. And then you've got Quakers and other pacifists saying, this is against my conscience, I cannot do this. In those kinds of cases, I'm far more persuaded by arguments of conscience. And I was wondering why that is, and whether it's really anything to do with conscience, and perhaps it's more about just not wanting to traumatize people.
So I think my first thought about those two examples and the contrast, Kieran, is in the war case, people are just citizens of a country, right? And then, in the kind of thinking about the Great Wars when people were conscripted, right, they had no choice. That's just how things were. Whereas in the nearby possible world where there's parliamentary conventions which have whipping or no whipping or whatever, people have chosen to become MPs in a certain sort of system. So then they can't complain if the system then, which they decided to go into, then says, well, you have to do this, that, or the other. I mean, they made a choice. So that was a compromise they were going to make in order to be an MP. So I think that for me, that's the difference there in those two cases. Why I'd be far more sympathetic for conscientious objections amongst conscripts than amongst MPs, as it were.
Or amongst, presumably, then professional armies.
Yes, amongst professional armies, that's right. I mean, so there's always a joke, isn't there? There's every so often there's a sketch. Isn't there a famous Monty Python sketch where Eric Idle comes in and says, "Oh, I can't believe this. I've been asked to go and fight," right? And he's a professional soldier. And the joke is, well, that's what you signed up to do. He said, well, there's like death and everything. It's horrible. Right?
It is like
that's why it's funny.
But this is what some people think should be the case with doctors. I mean, doctors should be told early on in their training, if you take this view, do not enter general practice or anything that involves complicity with abortion. That should be made clear to them early on. And so the question of traumatizing people doesn't come up because they won't be in that position anyway. They will say, well, it's unfair. In fact, they'll say it's discriminatory. And they might even invoke religious discrimination. Catholics are not welcome here, for example. That's the way it would be framed if it becomes the court. And I think we're back with the desirability of the compromise we talked about earlier. As Kieran says, you don't want to traumatize people, although remember that, quite a lot of doctoring is traumatic anyway. I mean, looking at dead bodies, there are all sorts of things we ask doctors to do that people don't like. But let's say there's a particular sort of moral trauma involved in being pressurized to do something which is deeply against your conscience, asked to be complicit in murder. We want to spare people that. We should also respect people's conscience because it is wrong to encourage somebody to do something that is wrong. And it is wrong to go against your conscience for the reason that Aquinas, I think, convincingly pointed out. So it's wrong to put someone under pressure to do something that they consider wrong. Still, we get away from that by simply saying, well, we make it clear who's allowed into the profession in the first place.
So there's a really interesting case in Russia where the fact that the Russian state has refused to accept that it is at war with Ukraine. It is merely undergoing a special military operation, means that members of the Russian army can refuse to fight in Ukraine, because if they were at war, they would not be legally allowed to refuse to fight or resign or whatever. But because it's not a war, they can refuse to fight, even though they are soldiers. I think many of them are professional soldiers, though Russia still has quite a few conscripts, I think. But it's an interesting thing, at the moment, that there are lots of people in Russia being made to fight in Ukraine, and some of them are exploiting this loophole, that the fact that it's not a war, according to Russia, but the idea that whether or not it's a war is supposed to be the thing that makes a difference. If your country is at war, as a citizen of your country, you are compelled to defend the country, whereas if it's just a military expedition, the case for compulsion doesn't make sense.
There's an interesting issue about minorities and religious minorities, and I could see how people who are making the case for conscience, who are outside of a group, might lean harder in some cases on that justification than people within the group. So if you take the issue of abortion, I could imagine that people making the case for conscience on this issue who aren't themselves pro-life, saying, well, there's certain religious groups, Catholics, but then of course lots of Protestant groups as well, who take a pro-life position, and we need to be non-discriminatory towards them. But then, as I think Piers pointed out, lots of pro-lifers, they're not going to be saying, I believe this because I'm a Catholic, this is my own personal views that are in accordance with my Catholic or whatever it is faith. They're going to be saying, no, this is murder. So everybody should be pro-life. This is a general stand that everyone should agree with, no matter which religion they're from, or even if they don't have a religion. So there's an interesting tension there. I mean, maybe there's not a contradiction. Maybe you can both say of a group, they should get a free vote, or they should get an exemption because they tend to be of a particular religion. We don't want to discriminate against that religion. And people within that group can say, no, this has got nothing to do with being a member of a particular religion. But nevertheless, to make the first kind of argument when people within the group are making the second kind of argument, you kind of have to say, oh, well, ignore what they're saying. A far better understanding of what's going on here is about this special exemption for minorities.
I mean, there's a really interesting thing here about liberalism, right? So one of the points of conscience that I've had to think carefully about before is when I was on the job market and I was applying to institutions in the US, many of those institutions ask people to sign a statement of faith. If they're going to teach at the university, you have to agree to the religious views of the university. And I made a decision just not to apply to any of those jobs. And if I applied to a job that turned out to have one of those, unbeknownst to me at the time, I would refuse to accept an offer. And in fact, I did go on to work for a religious college. And after I got the offer, I just said, just to check, you're okay with me not being a believer, right? And they went, yeah, that's fine. But one of the interesting things about liberalism is it's not that you go, hey, we're not sure whether God really exists, so we're just going to have tolerance for different answers to this question because we collectively lack conviction on this. The college that I ended up working for very much had conviction. It was a Methodist college. They thought that God did exist. I was one of the few rather exotic non-believers at the college. And this was an issue that, I was definitely in a minority group in South Central Kansas. But the tolerance and the pluralism isn't, as it were, a lack of conviction. So it should be perfectly compatible with the majority thinking, no, everybody should be entitled to abortion, and the minority thinking, no one should get abortions. And nonetheless, the justification for the pluralism isn't that lack of conviction. It's that you think it's better to live in a society where people are able to freely have the convictions that they have.
Listen, super interesting. And we've gone on to all sorts of different things here. I think I'm probably going to call an end to that that discussion. Thanks all three of you for joining us. Kieran, thanks for coming on. First of all, we'll definitely have you back.
It was a pleasure.
And Graeme, thanks for coming back.
Yeah, thanks.
And Piers, good to have you back with us as well.
Thank you.
And thank you to you for listening. And all being well, you'll listen again to another Philosophy Takes on the News.